All right, so let's get started. Again, good morning. I know folks are calling in from lots of places all around the world. So where I am, it's morning, so good morning. Good afternoon for our friends and colleagues in Europe, and good evening for our friends and colleagues in Asia and the Pacific. Aloha kakō, and welcome to Reimagining and Rebuilding the World, Indigenous Peoples and Energy Access. My name is China Ching, and I am the Director of Programs at the Christensen Fund. We are an international foundation based in the US that works to support the rights, dignity, and self-determination of Indigenous peoples around the world. Today's briefing was born from conversations between friends and colleagues about this really extraordinary time that we're all experiencing. The pandemic, I think, has really made us all look differently at our lives and our relationships and what we all want in the future. So as an Indigenous woman, I feel like this is such an incredible time. I've never experienced a time like this before, where the discussions on power, on privilege, on justice, and rights are really becoming part of a larger everyday conversation. I keep asking my family and my friends if they've ever felt this kind of moment before, and everyone says never. So this is an incredible time of opportunity, of connection, of relationships. And I think we also all recognize that it's an incredible time of uncertainty. So I'm calling in from southern Montana in the United States, and right now the morning sun is bright fuchsia from nearly 2 months of wildfires. So with rapidly shifting and uncertain economic futures, large-scale energy projects, including extractive and renewable projects, are being framed as steady pathways to weather this uncertainty, both this economic and environmental uncertainty that we're facing. So we're faced with this choice to replicate the current system with different technologies and some new actors, or to collectively reimagine and rebuild. So just some quick briefing to this, background to this briefing. So globally, Indigenous peoples represent about 5% of the world's population, but make up 15% of the world's extreme poor and a third of the rural poor. This data is important because rural poor form the bulk of those without energy access, and making Indigenous peoples a critical but often ignored demographic that needs to be put at the center of the global dialogue on energy. At the same time, Indigenous territories have hosted and continue to host countless energy projects, including now large-scale renewable energy projects, often without respect to their rights and the lack of meaningful consultation, resulting in minimal direct benefit or compensation. These projects, including renewable energy projects, have resulted in conflicts and death, mass displacements, and destruction of livelihoods and lifelines. This lack of respect and recognition for Indigenous rights ignores some of the most vital leadership, knowledge, and really experience on sustainability in the world. Again, while Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the world's population, they manage or hold tenure over 25% of the world's land surface and support 80% of the remaining global biodiversity. So we all know we need to reimagine, and we all know we need to rebuild a different world. So really this session is trying to dive deeper into that. It's about reimagining and rebuilding in partnership with Indigenous peoples. So we have a panel of 4 powerful Indigenous experts to be able to give us some good food for thought and good connection and relationship. So again, in the spirit of building relationships and building a community, I thank you to everyone who is introducing themselves and saying where they're calling in from in the chat. Please continue to do so. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is Polita Clark, who is an associate editor and columnist at the Financial Times, where she writes on corporate life and climate change, as well as features on other articles. In her 18 years at the Financial Times, she has held a number of senior editing and reporting positions, including deputy news editor, aerospace correspondent, and environmental correspondent. Her environmental writing has won awards in the US and Asia, and in 2019, she was named Environmental Journalist of the Year for the third year in a row at the British Press Awards. So we're really honored to have you, Palita. Welcome.
You would think I would have stopped doing that by now. Thanks so much, China. Great to see everybody. One of the terrific things about the pandemic, I guess, is that we've all learned how we can have these sorts of meetings where we've just are seeing a screen full of people from Bangladesh to Boulder to Berlin is really quite something. So it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about an issue that really hasn't received as much attention in the financial world and beyond that it ought to have. As a former environment correspondent at the FT, I am all too aware about the importance of reducing carbon emissions and the need to foster clean energy alternatives to fossil fuels. But at the same time, as you're about to hear today, there's been growing resistance to some large renewable energy projects amongst many Indigenous communities. And many of these groups live in regions where they lack access to official land titles, but those land titles are granted to companies by governments without consent, consultation or compensation. And that's led to some quite embarrassing moments for large companies and some philanthropic bodies that are all understandably and admirably keen to foster green energy. So we have an excellent panel of speakers who'll be able to explain firsthand today what the problems are and how they can be resolved. Just a couple of housekeeping points first. Although this event has been open to invited guests, it's not off the record. So do feel free to publicize it. And the hashtags that I'm asking people to use are climate justice, all one word, and just transition, all one word. The meeting is being recorded, so if you prefer not to be filmed, just turn your camera off and keep it off during the duration of the session. Our speakers have kindly agreed to speak for 75 minutes, so we'll be aiming to end well, I know what it is in New York and London time, but sorry for offending everyone, but it's around 10:45 a.m. New York time, about 3:45 here in London, and fairly ungodly hours for many of you I know around the world, but 75 minutes is what we're aiming for. We are keen to hear from all of you during the discussion. So please, if you have a question or an observation, write it in the chat box down at the bottom where you've been, I can see everybody's completely conversant with that already. Write it in and we'll be trying to take as many of those questions as we go through along, although we will be leaving time at the end for questions and answers as well. So I'd like to now introduce our speakers. Joanne Carling is a human rights activist and environmentalist from the Philippines who has been defending the rights of Native and marginalized peoples for more than 20 years. And in recognition of this work, she received the Champions of the Earth Lifetime Achievement Award in 2018 from the UN Environment Programme. Carla Fredericks is the Chief Executive of the Christensen Fund, which is a private foundation that supports the rights of Indigenous people. Carla has an extensive background in finance and law and human rights. She served as counsel to the Standing Rock Sioux tribe when they were opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline. And last year, she played an important role in the investor-led effort to change the name of the Washington football team. Ikal Anyali is the founder and executive director of Friends of Lake Turkana, which is a non-profit group in Kenya that works to support the world's largest permanent desert lake. Ikal's efforts to stop Ethiopia's Gibe 3 dam on the Omo River, which is Lake Turkana's largest source of water, won her the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize in 2012. And finally, we have Clara Pratt, who is Executive Director of the Navajo Nation's Washington, D.C. office, and the co-founder and president of Navajo Power, which is a public benefit corporation that develops large utility scale clean energy projects in partnership with tribal communities. Clara served on President Joe Biden's transition team, and last year she won the Pritzker Emerging Environmental Genius Award. So I hope that's given everyone a sense of the sort of company that you're in today. So Joanne, I wonder if you can kick us off and just give us an overview of what Indigenous groups have been facing as the energy transition has been gathering pace.
Thanks, Pilita, and a good day to everyone. Let me first start by saying that Indigenous peoples are fully supporting the just transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. And we feel that this is an urgent matter that the global community should address. It is urgently needed, but it requires a transformational change from business as usual approach to ensuring the protection of human rights, addressing inequality, and empowering communities. That is the shift that we need to ensure that the development of renewable energy will not be repeated as in the past. If we look at the record, for example, of large hydro dams, 80 million people were displaced. And it's more because that report was coming from the World Commission on Dams, which was 20 years ago. And in addition, there's also more than 472 million, and these are the poor people in the rural areas largely, that were adversely affected by the dam construction. And yet, the dam builders are now making use of the need to shift to renewable energy. It's greenwashing so that they can continue their business as usual. And on top of that, with all the dams that were built in Indigenous territories, many Indigenous territories don't even have the power because they are not generated for them. It's generated for business, for industries, for tourism, for urban areas, but not for Indigenous peoples whose lands and resources were destroyed. And that is exactly what's happening now also with the building of solar energy and windmills in Indigenous territories that do not have the consent of the community. So it's again resulting to land grabbing. So this is the scenario that we want to change. If we are to shift to renewable energy, then we need to ensure that human rights is the framework, addressing inequality or ensuring inequality, justice, and gender sensitive energy development is very much needed. And the reason why, by the way, I'm mentioning gender sensitivity is because a lot of the victims are women. When women are displaced from our communities, we become more vulnerable to abuse. And exactly that's the scenario. Women are being raped and abused while they search for other livelihoods because they're out of their territories. Now, this is where the point where I want to introduce the Right Energy Partnership, because that's exactly the framework of why we have the Right Energy Partnership, to ensure, again, that the human rights framework for renewable energy is there, but also that communities are provided access to energy. Like already mentioned, majority of Indigenous peoples in rural areas, in spite of the fact that they are hosting energy projects, do not have energy. And if we put communities at the center as part of decision making in terms of renewable energy development, that would lead to their empowerment, that would ensure that their needs are being addressed, including women, their resource management systems that are sustainable are going to be enhanced. So it really ensures that indigenous communities are not only going to benefit, but are going to strengthen their role in sustainable resource management while addressing their livelihoods, and that it is also ensuring that women are being empowered in this process. So that is why we're pushing for the Right Energy Partnership as an effective mechanism and tool to make sure that the just transition is going to be equitable for and that it's sustainable, and that it will serve, it will ensure that people and the planet is at the center of climate change solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. That's such a powerful point about, well, literally about power, about Indigenous groups not actually getting access to the very power that whose generation is displacing them. I just missed that. Was it 80 million or 8 million that report?
80 million.
Okay, 80, fine.
80.
Yeah. And as you say, that was done many years ago. Thank you so much. Carla, I'd like to move to you. Now, we obviously have a lot of representatives from philanthropic foundations and groups in the audience today, and I know you have strong views about the good and less good philanthropic behaviour that has occurred in the past, as well as personal experience of how energy projects can go badly wrong. And I wonder if you could start off by sharing your own experience with the Big Dam project that didn't go as it might have.
Sure. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Joanne, for your powerful interventions. I'm actually going to share my screen here. I'm an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation in North Dakota. And this is a picture of our tribe's chairman here, George Gillette, with his hand over his face. And the person here is the head of the Bureau of Reclamation. And this is the moment when the tribe, our tribe, had to sign over much of our ancestral homelands, particularly homelands along the Missouri River, for construction of a large dam project that started in 1947. And the reason that I think that it's important that everyone see this is to understand the true devastation and the true lack of power that Indigenous communities have in dealing with these larger interests. So this was for construction of the Garrison Dam. The dam is now the 5th largest earthen dam in the world. Around the dam, there's as much coastline as the state of California. And it was built in order to provide electricity for the region, although it did not provide electricity for our tribe. So there were downriver benefits to non-native communities. And many communities up until this century actually didn't have electricity and heat from the national power grid. So we lost a huge amount of acreage, 152,000 acres that were flooded out. And these lands were owned by our tribe since time immemorial. The tribe did protest, but the government was going to take the land by eminent domain anyway. And so what you see in this picture is a situation where the tribal leader was really between a rock and a hard place. Get nothing for the tribe or sign over your rights. I'll also share here a picture of what happened. So my family is from, I don't know if you can see my little magnifier here, but my family is from the community of Elbow Woods, which is down here on the lower right. And this white line, light blue line, is the original Missouri River. And this is what flooded. This is the dam itself. What's interesting about this, and what you can only really see from a map, is how separated all of our communities became because of the dam. So they built a little bridge here called the Four Bears Bridge, where you could go across from Elbow Woods to Twin Buttes. That was part of the negotiation, because my community was removed to both White Shield and Twin Buttes. And so there had to be connectivity between these communities. But then if you look over here, a lot of our relatives are from Mandaree. And so what would have been a pretty straightforward river crossing became, is a pretty significant drive. And then Newtown is actually at the top where they put the Bureau of Indian Affairs office. And that's where Native people, have to do a tremendous amount of business to interact with the federal government as part of their day-to-day affairs. So getting from my community in Twin Buttes to Newtown takes still today about 85 minutes. So this is pretty significant for us. The other thing that I just wanted to bring up in all of this, aside from the trauma and the loss of agricultural land, because our community was mostly farm and agricultural community along this river. Twin Buttes, where we were relocated, White Shield, Rose Glen, these are all Mandaree, super arid, rock heavy shale areas. And the renewable energy aspect of this was not an impediment to oil and gas development that we are now experiencing. And so even though this provided so-called clean energy, it still became the case that because these oil deposits were discovered all over here in the Bakken Shale region, that oil and gas development happened and is happening starting in about 2010. And the saddest part of the story to me, I'm picking up on Joanne's point about the impact on women and sexual violence, is because of the contested understanding about who is responsible for policing around the dam itself, because of the confusion about land title by the federal government, state, and tribe. And because there's so much coastline to police, there's actually, because of the man camps and the extractive industry development, a problem of mobile meth labs around the dam, which particularly in the winter become a huge issue because the dam ice is over and there really is no functional way to police them. So I just wanted to share that as sort of the impact that is not theoretical, but is actually quite real for communities, and we've been through it and experienced it. There's also, I just want to mention language loss, culture loss, all of the things that Joanne talked about. We absolutely experienced that. It's been a tragedy for our community. But I also wanted to mention, since we're in a philanthropic audience, the current moment, which is that we have this Sustainable Development Goal target, SDG 4, which the idea is that there will be clean energy for all as part of those targets. And I think the work that Joanne is doing is really exceptional, looking at SDG 4 as a matter of risk for Indigenous peoples because of the potential harms that Indigenous peoples can experience with a lack of free, prior, and informed consent to these projects, but also an opportunity to mainstream the promises of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in these processes. So the question is, how does philanthropy step in? So I've been involved for a long time in thinking about how to align large endowments, like the endowments that philanthropy has, with values of whatever organization. And you hear a lot in philanthropy about aligning portfolios with mission. And I think it's really interesting to think about in this context what this might mean. So if we green portfolios, are we inadvertently harming Indigenous peoples? And I think it's really important that philanthropic folks on the program side, on the finance side, really understand that intent is really not the same thing as impact. And philanthropy is a powerful actor in civil society. I would argue that philanthropy not only has opportunities to carry forth best practices in human rights, but actually responsibilities because of the amount of resources that philanthropy is responsible for disseminating throughout the world. And I think that I just want to say this is a call to action to be aware of and in connection with Indigenous communities in whatever renewable energy work these different foundations are doing. And I know how siloed some of these organizations are. So I think it's just really important that human rights dialogue be part of environmental dialogue and climate dialogue. There are incredible asymmetrical power dynamics that still exist with Indigenous communities because of centuries of marginalization and colonization and oppression. And we need to recognize that in philanthropy and work to cure as best we can in these different scenarios, that asymmetry. And if we're committing to impact investments, we have to take an integrated capital approach to ensure that Indigenous peoples are coming to the table with some level of equal footing. So in that way, I think that this moment also, as China said earlier, presents a lot of opportunity. This is an opportunity for reconciliation, for restorative justice for Indigenous peoples, for doing things differently. And I think that philanthropy has a very unique opportunity to lead in how we consider these issues. So with that, I'm excited to hear from these wonderful colleagues that we have today. I thank China and Anne for putting this panel together.
Thank you so much, Carla. And thanks for that presentation. There's really nothing as powerful as a personal story to bring home the theoretical. Carla, I want to turn to you because Lake Turkana and clean energy have also not had the best of relationships. In fact, there's been a fairly unhappy history, dams again playing a big part. I just wondered, could you talk us through what the biggest problems have been there?
Thanks, Pilika. Thanks again to China and all the organizers of this conversation. It really is, as everyone has said before me, it's very important to have this discussion now. So again, like Carla, my interaction with this work was really because of the Gibe 3 dam being built in Ethiopia. And because, as we, some people may know where I am right now is in Turkana, which is a northwest part of Kenya. We border South Sudan, southern Ethiopia and Uganda, and then across we share the lake with Marsabit, which is again in Kenya. It's a pastoralist region. We depend on natural, the natural environment for water, pasture. Our struggles for survival is totally dependent on the ecosystem. So when in 2006, I first learned that there was a dam that was being built in Ethiopia, as a child, my father had been struggling against the government of Kenya, building a dam on the Tapel River, which again was such a key ecosystem for pastoralists. So it was diverting water, and it meant that a lot of the downstream communities did not get water. So I did not know much about dams, no engineer, no environmental technical expertise. I just had to ask communities what they felt about it. We always are struggling for again, the struggle between Ethiopia and Kenyan communities along the lake has been consistent. We've had conflict for the last number of decades, again, all just fight for survival. And so it was very critical for me to just start asking, what does this mean for communities? As we were trying to do, and many people say, you fought the dam and you won. Not necessarily. I mean, the Ethiopian government was building Gibe 4, Gibe 5. So you're not only dealing with just one dam, it's a series of dams. And so you start struggling with one dam and then Gibe 4, Gibe 5, and then there's a whole, we're trying to deal with food security. And the next thing you're doing sugarcane and cotton, and you realize sugarcane is not for food security, it's ethanol. So it's just one struggle after the other. As we were discussing the dam, the Kenyan government decided that maybe we should discuss the wind farm. And I remember, naive as I was, going into a Ministry of Environment office and saying, yes, the wind farm, the Lake Turkana wind power is local. It will bring local jobs. It is local domestic generation. I just didn't know that our current president, Uhuru Kenyatta, has huge stakes in the wind farm. So we were pushing for another evil. And the next thing we knew, communities were being spoken to about, let's discuss what this wind farm will do. Something that, philanthropy knows, we end up signing sheets when we're having meetings. Communities were signing the attendance sheet. Little did they know that ended up being the consent form. They did not know that the attendance sheet was consent for them. And then they signed it. And the next thing they were told they had consented to give land. Initially it was 50 acres of land to try and see if we will have a wind farm. And the next thing it's about 150 1,000 acres of land that's being taken, that is critical migratory region. Many, as pastoralists, our mobility is very critical to our survival. And so a lot of the migratory zones have been closed up. And as this energy is being discussed, the local communities do not have energy, as Joanne was talking about. Usually it is basically to be generated and taken to the grid. And so that struggle, that constant struggle, and again, speaking for other parts of Kenya, you have the huge geothermal project that was being funded by the World Bank and the European Investment Bank, again, displacing communities who are pastoralists and are now been villagized. So you've been living in your little manyatta with your animals, able to crisscross rangelands. And all of a sudden you're told you'll be given a house with two-bedroom house, not taking into account the cultural aspects of how men sleep in different households, the women sleep in different households, and now all of a sudden you all have to share one household. And on top of that, your animals have got to zero graze, something that our livestock are not used to. So it's just been such a struggle dealing with all this. And at the same time, it's always, again, this word of corporate social responsibility. And I know, Carla was speaking about the philanthropy side. There's been a lot of, project proposal around working with the corporations and coming up with, stakeholder engagement, all these things. And communities find themselves looking for conflict sensitive investments that don't really work for them because it's what the proposals are pushing for. Many of us have had to walk away from funding, but that's what it is, because you just have to decide, where to put the struggle. And as we are pushing for this in this same region that we are in, again, as Carla was saying, there's oil. So there's a whole oil exploration that's happening. So it's not that the wind, the green energy is really to stop the fossil extraction. It's not. It's just, they keep saying now, what is the best energy mix? And at the same time, potential it's also been earmarked for the nuclear power. So because again, it's closer to the wind, to the water point. So you're in this space where you're trying to ask yourself, what is this energy mix that this country is asking for? But then how do we start to ask for energy justice in a changing, with the reality of the climate crisis, and really debate with it? Again, we've been seeing this conversation of the just transition, but when you really look at it, one of the challenges that we, as environmentalists working in the continent, is the realization that even for the just transition to happen, the minerals that are needed for this just transition are mostly found within the African continent. You talk about the DRC, and as Joanne was saying, if you look at the Grand Inga Dam in the DRC, it is really it's a dam that is to generate hydropower, to get power to the mines, not to give the people. It is really to remove the minerals from the mines. And so if we just talk about the just transition without asking where is the source of the minerals, you then find that we become part of the problem. You take hydropower, we take land from communities, we displace communities, we generate power, take it to mines to mine cobalt, bauxite, aluminium, copper, that is going to, again, to the green energy revolution without really asking ourselves. So like all my colleagues have said, this is a critical time for all of us to start the conversation. It's not to say that it's fossil or green transition. It's just we've got to get it right, because of the hurry to transition. And I guess, the idea of a transition is we've got to unpack all those things. What's the economics, cultural issues involved in this? Because for us as an African people, for us as Indigenous people, our relations to our land and territories is more than economic or environmental. It is really social relations, as Carla was talking about, what it means to people. And so we've got to try and really ask ourselves, how do we meet that SDG? How do we ensure equity? How do we ensure equality? How do we ensure a gender sensitive, a gender responsive, a feminist lens to this process? And how do we make sure that we get it right? Because if it's going to be about technology only, Shell right now already has a renewable energy company. I mean, after all the cases in The Hague, Shell has a renewable energy company. So they have the resources, and it goes back to power. The current bad investors, the bad companies have the power and the money. All they need to do is change the name and do everything wrong. They will still take up land, they will still be corrupt. And so we've got to start to really think about it. And so in my thinking around this, it's thinking around how do we open up the spaces for candid conversations? really candid conversations outside, as Carla was saying, intent and impact, outside, the funding and outside, the proposals. And how do we really think about building that capacity of Indigenous communities, of local communities, so that they come on the table, not with a limp, but really able to, with the confidence that we are in this together. I think it's building those partnerships with local communities, with Indigenous communities, that they know they're in the long, they're in this for the long haul. It's not that if you fail, you won't get up. We've got to be able to say, we're trying this, we don't have all the answers, but we are willing to just really make that change that is important for all of us.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, and I mean that point you made, Carl, about the urgency of the need to find more green energy. It's that's really accelerated in the last 18 months, 2 years, since really I guess since the IPCC 2018 report came out and showed it. Really, we're not talking about 2050, we're talking about 2030. So yeah. Now I'd like to move to Clara, who is actually I think is. I think what's really interesting about the Navajo Nation is that it's been such a big coal supporter for so long. That has started to change, and Navajo Power is really part of that change, because you're offering a really compelling alternative to fossil fueled energy in the way that it's been done so far. So can you just give us an overview of what you've been doing at Navajo Power so far?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you all. It's wonderful to share the time with these esteemed panelists. My name is Clara Pratt. I'm one of the co-founders and partners at Navajo Power. And we started Navajo Power to really address the inequities of bad development, I guess you would say. So the common thread that I'm hearing and that I've heard from these amazing women is that we can go to different parts of the world, whether we're at Mandan, Hidatsa, Korea, the Philippines, or Africa, and you see the same issues, the same problems arising. The taking of resources, whether that's extractive or renewable, at the detriment of the local communities, and the disruption and social injustices that happen as a result of that. And the important thing that we noticed is that those same models were still being recreated under the auspices of green energy development. And we know that there's a misnomer that, oh, if it's green, it's good. There must be things being done in the correct way, because the people that are doing green energy, they care about people, right? But as Ekal pointed out, it's oftentimes the same bad actors doing same bad things under different names. And just because it's green doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It's good for people, it's good for communities, it's good for families. So when we started Navajo Power, we really looked at the way energy development was being done. First, we started on the Navajo Nation. We've extended our footprint to tribal lands throughout the United States. And there is a couple things that happen in regards to what we term as Indian country. Many of the tribal governments that were put in place by outside or external forces. So these are not traditional governments that people put in place themselves. They were imposed by the federal government, oftentimes to be signatories to extractive resources. Like, oh, we need to stand up a government so that we have a legal body to sign an agreement with, to take their coal, to take their uranium, to take their water, to take their oil. And when we look at it from that lens and we take into context FPIC, or free, prior, and informed consent, we see that there is a conflict that happens, because the government sometimes, not always, but sometimes, is not in direct agreement with the actual people, the grassroots people who are living on the land and using the land. So when we're going into communities to create sustainable development, we are starting from two sides. We're starting from the government, the tribal government side, as well as the federal government side, for all of the necessary permitting legal stuff. But more importantly, we start from the grassroots side, the actual people who are living on the land and in the communities. And these people are marginalized to such a degree as to not feel as though they have any right or ownership over this land that they've historically utilized since time immemorial. Because the land is held in trust by the federal government for the benefit of the Indian tribe, the government, again, government to government. And that's an important relationship. I don't want to diminish that, but somewhere along the way, individual people, real people get trampled over in these quests to build and create economic development. In my community of Lupton, Arizona, which is it's only maybe 10 miles from the highway, the I-40, you can see commerce going back and forth, but our household did not have electricity and running water until I was in college. And that was very common in these areas. We have power lines going over homes, much like Carla had mentioned about the dams. You have electricity running around all of these folks at their detriment, but not benefiting them at all. So it's still 15,000 plus homes on the Navajo Nation do not have potable water or electricity, and yet still are in sight of all of this development, of all of this commerce, of all of these power lines. So when we founded Navajo Power, we really wanted to make sure we're dealing with the grassroots people. So we're negotiating first and foremost with the Indigenous land users, whether or not they hold title to that land. If they are using that land, we are at the table with them discussing what their historic rights are to that land and how we can work with them. We're also discussing the cultural resource management aspect in terms of, just because this piece of land looks good for large utility scale solar, it's got all the right slopes, it's got all the right pieces, it's, adjacent to the grid and water and transmission, all of the things that you need for utility scale solar. We want to be mindful of, has there been historic use? Do the medicine men in the region say maybe we shouldn't work there? Maybe we shouldn't do something there because of some historic or traditional cultural piece. So we're looking at all those pieces first, because we do not want to get down the line to where we're signing a lease with the government proper, and you've got a group over here saying, wait a minute, that's not something that we want to do, because then we all have egg on our face. So doing development in a really super mindful way is critical. And then the other piece of it is just a few months ago, we launched another initiative called Navajo Power Home, because while we are focused on large utility scale solar, we heard from many of the folks there that yes, we're glad that you're doing utility scale solar. We're completely supportive of this move. We love the way you're doing it. However, how are we going to address off-grid, where it's still too expensive to get grid power to homes? So we launched Navajo Power Home as a companion company to Navajo Power Public Benefit Corporation to be that solution, to say, okay, home, you're over here, you want to be off the grid, it's too expensive to run a line. We're going to set you up with a small scale off-grid solution that provides, sustainable solar panels. And by the way, we're going to continue to service those solar panels for a period of time, 20, 30 years for the life of the project. We're taking some of that funding to be able to service those off-grid solutions, because many of our people have had solar before, but it was a one-time thing. It was put up and then it was forgotten about. There was no training or information given to operations and maintenance or anything like that. So there was an investment made and then it just went away, and it didn't have the upkeep necessary to continue those things functioning. The battery replacement that has to be done every 5 to 8 years or so. So we're committing to the long haul. And I think that's really important when we're talking in these communities. And as we often say, myself and one of my other partners, we're from Navajo Nation. We can't go anywhere. We have to do it right, because this is where we're from and we're going to stay here. So we're working with our neighbors and friends, and also providing them legal support and legal counsel, even if that means getting a native speaking attorney to explain what we're doing in both English and in Navajo. Many of our people, first language is still Navajo, so making things accessible all along the way. And another point is really being mindful of when we bring in labor forces, when we're actually putting up these large utility scale solar, we're following Navajo procurement and Navajo hiring and Indian hiring preference. And that's important for a couple of reasons. Obviously, it's good for the economy to hire local and hire tribal folks who are from that area. But a really important point is about what we've seen in some of these areas when you bring in lots of outsiders. There can be some really tragic dynamics that happen in those cases. There's racial tension. These camps of outsiders could be created. We've also seen an increase in sexual assault, violence, and human trafficking that occur in our communities. So just really looking at the entire lens of what it means to develop. You can take a very capitalist approach and say, this is how we're going to do it. And yes, you'll make money. but at what cost? What's the collateral cost and damage that you're doing there? So, you know, it's kind of a broad overview of how we're approaching development, how we're thinking about development, and how we want to replicate that in partnership with tribal governments and with grassroots community members, looking at the entire paradigm of development. And yes, it'll go into the grid, and yes, it'll power cities and all those sorts of things, but we're doing it in a way that we make sure we don't leave people behind. We don't leave people to the side, and there will be less collateral damage, or at least minimal, we hope, in terms of how we're developing this economy as we go forward. And with the announcement of the hydrogen moonshot, we know that hydrogen is now on the horizon here. And guess what? I've got hundreds of companies coming to the Navajo Nation saying, have we got a deal for you? We're going to be the hydrogen developer. And, you know, I think as we build out this model, it's important that we give this framework to tribal governments to say, here, these are the questions you should ask about how development is going to occur, and use this model, use it for the benefit of the people, so that when people come in, you kind of have a framework of mindful development and the questions that can be asked and the demands that ought to be made before you allow external companies, even us, to come in and develop on your lands for a very long period of time.
Thanks so much, Clara. That's so interesting. I want to ask Ikal and then Joanne, are you seeing any evidence of any sort of organizations in Kenya, or indeed beyond in Africa, or Joanne in the Philippines, Southeast Asia? Are you seeing any evidence of similar models being thought about or adopted there? Ikal, could you tell us first?
So through the work that we've done with the Rights Energy Partnership, with the leadership of Joanne and team, we're starting to have those conversations. Again, there's a lot of work that needs to go into looking at our energy policies, you know, because it's one thing, there's a lot of effort to generate it, but then because of the state capture of such energy infrastructure, there's very little space. While the policies allow, you know, the feed-in tariffs and how people can negotiate, but then there's just too much corruption to deal with. And so one of the conversations around devolution and how we can actually think about generating to sell within our local, you know, local communities and things like that. But then it is very still our policies, because of the control and just because of the corruption aspect, there is still a lot of control within governments to hold onto this. So it's we've got to keep, you know, chipping at it, but there's still a lot that needs to be done.
Yeah. And Joanne?
Yeah, there's actually a community-based renewable energy movement in Southeast Asia, with a lot of it's of course led by non-government organizations, but the one that's really focusing on indigenous peoples is Tunibong. It's based in Malaysia. And it's a unique.
Sorry, what was the name again? Could you mention that again?
Tunibong. Mm-hmm. It's an indigenous name, and the good thing is that they produce their own microhydro by recycling aluminum, and they tailor fit it to the needs of the communities. In fact, they are the ones who did the microhydro at the highest point, and they had to deliver it by helicopter because there's no road reaching the community in the watershed area. And that has led to better protection of the watershed, because then people see that with the microhydro, where the water is being used for their agricultural needs, for their domestic use, then they need to protect the watershed. And they've been building many of microhydro, and they are even combining it with solar, because during summertime the water is less, so then they shift it to solar, and that's the one that's providing power to energy to communities. And that actually even consolidated a lot of communities, because they have to make their rules and agree with the rules on how to manage this community-based energy, and it gave them a lot of ownership to these projects. And the good thing that we did was with the support of the international IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. They supported microhydro that will be developed by Tunibong for indigenous communities in Indonesia, and that they will teach the communities in Indonesia how to make those microhydro. So it's really also exchanging knowledge among indigenous peoples, but also making sure that it's community driven. And this is what we're trying to replicate with the Right Energy Partnership, really building already on what is there, the capacities and skills of indigenous peoples, because they know how it works in the communities. They know that once there's a strong sense of ownership by communities, the communities will also make sure it will work for them. And that's exactly what we see.
Yeah. Some interesting comments coming through in the chat box, by the way, with some audience members making the point that in Mayan communities in Guatemala, people there have had the same problem that you referred to right at the start there, Joan, where they protect natural resources but don't actually get to enjoy the right to energy once projects come in. And then another point that somebody's making about my old homeland, that some of the same issues that Clara mentioned are actually happening, are very much evident in remote Aboriginal communities, which I know has been the case for many, many years ago. Carla, I wonder if I can ask you, just going back to the investment and financial point here. You know, as you and others have mentioned, ESG issues, impact investment has become so big and important, or has grown so much in prominence, at least over the last year or so in particular. Last year, the chief executive of Rio Tinto, the mining company, stepped down, Jean-Sebastian Jacques, after his company basically destroyed Aboriginal heritage sites. And I just wonder, have events like that sharpened awareness and understanding of the sorts of issues we're talking about today, or not, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what we're really talking about is the risk lens. And I put a pithy comment in the chat, but it's very true that on these issues, you not only have environmental risk, but you also have social risk, which is really honestly not well understood by folks who do ESG work. We actually did a study when I was at the University of Colorado around the cost of the Dakota Access Pipeline. So due to the social uprising in DAPL, that pipeline cost all affected stakeholders, including investors, $12 billion. That was a $3 billion project. And so when you kind of start thinking about these as a matter of financial risk and financial loss, it really changes the dialogue a bit. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a good thing. I would like to get to a place within the world where we're thinking about environmental and social matters as matters that are important on their own. But for investors and philanthropy, of course, this audience, our institutional investors, not looking at the risk of these projects is very detrimental. So the Rio Tinto executive was asked to step down because of the risk that he ignored in blowing up the sacred sites of the Indigenous people in Australia. And I think that it's interesting and headline when it hits the C-suite. But for Indigenous communities, I also think it's important that we think about risk to community alongside risk to investors and risk to executives. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah.
But I also just want to back up Ikal's point that green isn't always good, and that environmental factors need to be looked at alongside social and governance factors, because what happened at Rio, as much as it was a social failure, was also a governance failure.
Right. Now, you, in the chat there, you talked about the fact that true FPIC de-risks projects, and I happen to know that means free, prior and informed consent, but I have to admit until this week I didn't. Perhaps you could just briefly just explain why that is such an important concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think all of us mentioned this at some point or another in our remarks. It's often the case with these projects that they're approached from a consultative framework. And a consultative framework is when the actor or the government comes in and tells the community about the project. And some of these entities profess to have, there's a big uptick in these so-called FPIC protocols or processes, but true FPIC is iterative, it's not coercive, and it really does take into full account the decision-making of the community. And when you don't have that all the way, as Clara rightfully pointed out, with these Indian Reorganization Act governments, these kind of governments that were set up to be able to have tribes seed resources for energy projects, particularly. If there isn't real buy-in, you're just going to continue to have problems. And it's interesting that industry hasn't really considered this. I think part of the reason is that these projects are funded through private financing vehicles, which are the profit of which for investors is all based on exits. So, you know, the investor is there for 5 years, and if they get out in time, then they make money. But as Clara said, as Ikal said, as Joanne alluded to, Indigenous peoples don't have that option. And so we will continue to fight projects that harm us. And that makes the projects less attractive financially.
Yeah. I mean, Clara, I wonder, could you talk to us just very briefly, you know, what does Navajo Power do about free, prior and informed consent? What are the sort of steps that you go through to make sure that this consent is gained?
So one of the first things we do when working in a community is we really have to understand the dynamics of the community. For example, on the Navajo Nation, you have the central government, but you also have local community governments through the forms of chapters or kind of like municipalities. That's another government layer. And then under that, you may have informal groups or, community members, grassroots organizations. So it's really understanding the dynamic between all of those 3 layers, 4 layers if you add the federal government on there. And not all of them are in agreement with each other. We've come into situations where the local municipal government, which is very small, you know, typically represents about 2,000 to 1,000 people, the government itself, the chapter government, does not have full community support, because one of the things that has been created is this multiple layers of bureaucracy. So to elect in a chapter government, you don't really need a lot of people to do that. So that leads a lot of people on the outside that don't feel like they're part of the dialogue, the official dialogue. So we go in and we see who the traditional land users are, who has historically been on that land. It takes an immense amount of on the ground work because BIA keeps records of who's grazing officially, but then there's unofficial grazers too, people that do not have grazing permits or BIA permits. And we want to make sure that we don't leave those folks out of the dialogue. And there may be people who their grandmother lived on that land and now they're living in Phoenix, but they still have a tie to that land and they come back and forth for ceremony. So it's a lot of on the ground talking to elders and community members and saying, well, who was traditionally here and can you tell us about that? And finding those people and having a level of cultural fluency and language fluency that allows you to navigate those pathways. So it's an intensive work, but again, it de-risks the project to such a large extent that it's worth that time and effort and investment to make those efforts. Because through that work, we found that sometimes the BIA records are not correct, they're incorrect, or there's an incongruency between the BIA records and the tribal records. And so, you know, infamously, I guess I would say, we got a land lease signed with the Navajo Nation, land withdrawal, not lease, excuse me, but as a withdrawal signed from the Navajo Nation government that had one community being the signator. And when we got all the way through the process, another community said, hey, wait a minute, that's our traditional chapter boundary. So the Navajo Nation had to claw it back. And we had a lot of damage control to do because we were told as an entity that it was this chapter's land, when essentially the records were all wrong. And going back to historic documents, it was actually another chapter's land. So we had to go through the whole process over again. So again, very time intensive work, and you will have missteps along the way because the records, we didn't recognize boundaries, right? It was more historic usage, and boundaries were imposed on these communities. It's not necessarily the traditional way of looking at land. So it's navigating traditional lands through a very untraditional lens.
Right, that is incredibly interesting just to hear of your own experience there. I just really would like to invite people watching to ask any questions of our speakers. You've been sending in some very interesting observations here, but if you would like to ask any questions of anyone, please just write them into the chat box. I know that we have a monstrous repository of wisdom here collectively, so so please feel free to do that. And I just would draw people's attention in the chat box, if you haven't looked at it, some very interesting examples here of a not very green sounding or not very helpful sounding wind farm depleting groundwater, resulting in benefits being taken by local officials. Then when local communities tried to own a local wind farm themselves, they were stymied at the national level by people who made it impossible for the community to own the project. Actually, that's a familiar sounding case, I think, but definitely a very instructive one. Thank you, Sandra, for sending in some additional background on the Rio Tinto situation, which by no means resolved, I know. And thanks too for some extra information there on FPIC, the free, prior and informed consent concept in the Philippines. And just actually, that's an interesting one. It's talking about how it has a lot of challenges in the Philippines. So if a certain project is funded by the government, and then this FPIC process can be fast, but if it's solicited by Indigenous people, then the process is delayed, which is obviously unbelievable when you think about it. Not just ironic, I think, because the whole point of it is to help Indigenous communities. So that's actually an incredibly interesting point there. So, I mean, I have a lot more questions in our remaining time. But I would really invite people to send them in as well. But I'm just curious, you know, just a couple of weeks ago, quite a large report came out that documented the impact of Indigenous resistance to fossil fuel projects. And it showed that over the past decade, Indigenous resistance had really stopped the equivalent of around 400 new coal-fired power plants around the world, which is quite something. But I'm curious to know from all of you, really, maybe I can start with you, Joanne, you know, do you think that green energy developers are really, by and large, following in the same footsteps as fossil fuel developers? And I'm going to kind of lump large-scale hydro dam projects as opposed to micro hydropower. But do you think that they haven't really learned the lessons? Is that one of the big messages for today?
Yes, I think that's also why we're particularly on the dam builders, right? That's why they're actually pushing for funds to build more large dams you know, as a solution to climate change. And that is really worrying, and that's why we need to already put the brake somehow, that should not happen. But also, if you look at the, like, I forgot who mentioned it, but a lot of the big oil companies are now setting up their renewable companies. So, and it's basically what I said, it's going to be business as usual. There will be no, they will not seek any kind of social license from Indigenous communities to operate. And they have also adopted certain strategies, like, for example, on how to deal with free, prior, and informed consent. In the Philippines, for example, what has happened is that because it's part of our law, and what a mining company did was, the process was to consult the traditional elders to be the one to give the consent, right? And so that what the company did was they set up their own council of elders and paid these fake leaders to get the consent. So they're instead of, and that's the sad thing, instead of really learning from experience, they're still trying to manipulate. But I would also like to say that some companies are learning their lessons. They, for example, in the case of Chile, where there's really a strong conflict among the Mapuche because of their opposition to the dam. So now they're now realizing, the companies and even the government has realized that the only way they can stop these conflicts is to finally agree to do it right and make sure that the communities will give their consent to, so that the projects can go ahead. So
Yeah, I mean, one of the audience's members has raised a really interesting point. Ikal, I'm going to ask you about this. Making the point that a lot of these projects receive multilateral bank support and funding. And of course, there has been tremendous pressure put on multilateral banks for many, many years over large-scale hydro. I rather suspect, but I guess I'm asking you, do we need to see the same sorts of pressure being brought to bear for wind power and solar power projects as well?
Thank you. I think one of the biggest challenges, just building on what Joanne is saying, is that first, it's not the typical multilateral financing institutions that we know. So there's the usual World Bank, European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, but then there's a new source of funding. So I know right now, like for us with the wind farm, it was the OPIC that was the overseas, and that one.
Just to remind everyone what the OPIC is.
Overseas Private Investment Corporation, and right now I think it's been mixed up with USAID. We're seeing, a lot of the funders within the continent, at least within Africa, are moving from aid to trade. So a lot of the financing is no longer just supporting communities, but it's actually through transactions. With the wind farm, again, one of the biggest challenges we had was it was pension funds from Europe. So we, now again, a new source of financing that we've never been able to deal with. So it's new sources of funding that are coming in. Before, everyone focused on the BRICS, but now it's new sources of funding that are coming in that we are all just trying to figure out how to maneuver, how to manage, how to challenge. So for us, it's, yes, we've got to, but again, we've got to start bringing in the citizens from those countries. It's really, that's why it's a global crisis. The crisis is no longer a regional or geographical crisis, it is a global crisis. And until we see it that way, it then becomes harder. And just to join to what Joanne was saying, some of the impacts are really, you can see that economic and social, as Carla was talking about, the cultural fragmentation of Indigenous people and the social relations, how it's fragmented. But then we are also seeing the feminization of poverty. They come in with all this, 2 women hired at the top, and you think gender diversity and all these reports around gender, but in real sense, it really is the feminization of poverty. But more so, one of the biggest things that no one's looking at, everyone is looking at the generation of the energy, but the infrastructure related to energy transmission is a big crisis that is happening, because it's taking up lands and territories, cutting through forests, cutting through any ecosystems. I think we've got to also not only look at where the energy is being generated, but how the transmission is being done and what happens through this, because it's really also impacting on the water sources of very many communities. So it's really looking at the bigger holistic aspect that we've got to start to look at.
Yeah. Clara, I mean, that this funding point, it is interesting that the sources of funding for clean energy are quite different and more disparate than they have been in the past, for example. Is that something that you've come across? I mean, I know, being a public benefit corporation, I guess your organization's slightly different to some, but I mean, do you have any thoughts on what sort of pressure can be brought to bear on these funders as well?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. Funding for tribal projects has historically been difficult because there is a fear or a lack of understanding about tribal jurisdiction and tribal law when you're entering into contracts and land leases and things of that nature. And we've faced our fair share of funding challenges in that regard. And I think one of the things that we hope to do is demystify working in that space, in that process, and hopefully providing for industry a sense of of calm that, you know, tribal courts and jurisdictions are robust, they're advanced, and they have the capabilities to handle disputes should they arise. One of the things that I think is really important to help investors to understand is that the leases aren't going to look the same, but they can accomplish the same things, and providing that information is really critical. The other thing that a lot of folks want to do is a full waiver of sovereign immunity, which is not going to fly with most tribal jurisdictions and tribal courts. So we just need to demystify that process.
What do you mean by full waiver of sovereign immunity?
For investors, so that they have some assurance. So many companies that come in from the outside want to be able to sue outside of tribal court systems. And it really indicates a lack of trust in the tribal court system. But if you look at the case laws, particularly for large tribes like Navajo, Tohono O'odham, their court systems have long been established. So you get just as good, if not better, outcomes in tribal court than you would in other courts. So by waiving sovereign immunity, you're essentially saying that the tribal government consents to being sued. And they consent to being sued in federal court usually. So,
yeah.
So that really is a starter set.
Oops, just while you're
even getting the project off the ground if you can.
Yeah,
Can you try to help? There we go. Yeah, so you know, I think it really hinders
Oops, sorry, Clara.
You can't agree to the legal framework at the outset. So hopefully,
your broadband connection is sounding like mine often sounds. Unfortunately,
oh, dear.
I just wonder, Carla. I mean, that those sorts of legal issues are really interesting. I'm guessing, I saw you nodding your head as Clara was speaking, and I'm guessing that those sorts of attempts to basically protect legal activity on the part of companies is pretty widespread, and something that philanthropic groups in particular need to be aware of, right?
Yeah, I mean, for an entity to insist that a tribe waive its sovereign immunity or cede its jurisdictional authority to a friendlier forum for the investment group flies in the face of free, prior, and informed consent. And what has happened is that in order to access financing, and I think this is what Clara was starting to say, that there is a very coercive process between the folks that have the money and the tribe, where the folks that have the money insist that the tribe cede its rights. And the free and free, prior, and informed consent ensures that decision-making is free of that type of coercion. So if you don't have, again, it's about leveling the playing field, and that's free, prior, and informed consent isn't a practice, it's a right. And it's a safeguard for Indigenous peoples in recognition of the centuries of the lack of that in these types of arrangements, going all the way back to land takings at the outset of colonization in these areas. And so, you know, a lot of the historical kind of context is important, because none of these communities freely gave up their rights or their land. They were not in a position to be able to do that. And it's very similar here with these renewable energy deals. There's not a level playing field. And so that's really what the right of free, prior, and informed consent and these processes and best practices seek to solve for.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I can see the clock has somehow wound around to the 75-minute mark. And as a moderator, I'm now breaking the golden rule and about to go over time. But I just wanted to draw people's attention in the chat to a comment that Fahana Yaman, one of today's, one of the people who's made today possible, and also actually one of the architects of the Paris Agreement, someone who's been involved in climate change policy work for many, many years, makes a very good point about that. And that is namely that the carbon community has been quite carbon centric and not really familiar with these free and prior informed consent principles and rights. And as she says, it's much better known in the biodiversity and human rights world. And it's something that needs to become much better known, I believe. But I'm going to wind up from me now and just thank our speakers from me and just say it's been a tremendously interesting conversation, very eye-opening and just extremely good to hear from people on the ground who've had a lifetime of experience in these issues. Talk about what a lot of people, I think, you know, frankly, here in the UK and in other parts of Europe and elsewhere are possibly not as I mean, I think a lot of people are aware, but it just more broadly, perhaps, the sorts of recognition of the problems that have been raised today is seriously needs to be raised. And I'm very pleased to have been part of an effort to do that today. But I'm going to hand back to China to say goodbye to you all. And from me, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pavita, and thank you so much to our panelists. I'm actually going to pass it to my colleague, Anne Henshaw, who was our other co-organizer, along with Natasha Hale, of this panel. So Anne will close us out. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, China. Thank you, everyone. A huge ocean of thanks, especially to our panelists, Joanne, Carla, Ikal, and Clara. Your work is inspiring, courageous, and vitally important as we seek real equitable solutions to the climate crisis. I want everyone to know on this webinar, these are people that represent organizations and communities that have power and are ripe for partnership as we address some of the challenges that we talked about today. I also want to thank Polita for your excellent moderation. Hopefully you've left as inspired as we all are. And to China from the Christensen Fund and Natasha Hale from the Kellogg Foundation who helped co-organize this. Thank you for your vision and commitment to your communities and Indigenous peoples globally. Finally, to Farhana Yamin, Isabella Noero, and Hillary Heath for supporting the logistics and overall coordination for this meeting. This seminar is actually the second in a series being sponsored by the Climate Justice Just Transition Donor Collaborative. The first webinar focused on climate finance. The collaboration was initiated in 2021 by Oak Foundation, Porticus, IKEA, the Climate Justice Resilience Fund, and Bosch Foundation to grow philanthropic investment toward more justice-centered climate action, like we heard about today, and to do so in ways that permanently shift power and resources to those on the front lines. And we do this first by listening to leaders and activists like the ones you heard from today, to understand their priorities and where resources are most needed. We also seek to foster connections across movements and continents. This is a global problem, as we just heard, to tackle the systemic injustices and rising economic and social inequalities arising from climate change. The collaboration, next webinar will be on October 26th, and will bring together donors and practitioners from Africa working on agroecology, climate resilience, and pathways to climate justice. We hope the event will inform those of you working at the intersection of climate, human rights, food, and agriculture, as well as nature-based solutions. If you want to join future webinars or learn how to support our efforts, either as a philanthropic donor or a frontline expert, please contact our project coordinator, Farhana Yamin. There's additional information in the chat about the collaborative and Farhana's contact information. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. Take care, be well, stay safe, and until next time, thank you.